Hi everyone. I'm going to start off just by acknowledging the traditional owners of the lands on which we meet today, which here in Brisbane is the Turrbal and Jagera people, and I pay my respects to their ancestors and elders past, present and emerging. So today we have Dr. Dominic Andradi-Brown, who is a lead marine scientist at WWF. He conducts research there, evaluates conservation efforts, and also integrates climate-smart approaches into marine protection. He also works with the Global Mangrove Alliance, where he has co-developed the mangrove restoration tracking tool and contributes to the IUCN's mangrove and marine management initiatives. Today, he's going to be talking to us about his work on mangroves with WWF. He will discuss WWF's research on the effectiveness of natural protection laws, the risks of climate-driven mangrove loss, and the development of climate-smart conservation strategies, highlighting how science informs on-the-ground action. Dom?
Thank you. Thanks, Tina. So I want to just start by saying this work I'm going to talk about is really the last kind of 4 or 5 years of work I've been involved in at WWF, and it's really been a strong partnership. There's been a lot of partnership between both me sitting in WWF US and our WWF field teams around the world and the places where we're doing a lot of this mangrove work, but also a lot of academics. And so you'll probably see a lot of researchers actually based in the Brisbane area have been involved in this work. And so really the science I do as an NGO scientist is very strongly in collaboration with partners in universities. So a lot of this has been actually driven by postdocs and by researchers based here who I've kind of had a role in helping shape and steer some of this work to really apply to kind of what WWF needs to help inform our work. And so today I'm going to talk about these 4 different points. So I'm going to start by talking about what is climate smart conservation from WWF's perspective. And then I'm going to talk about these bottom 3 questions, which are really our questions we had at WWF a few years ago that we've spent the last few years trying to answer. So really thinking about how big a threat climate change is to mangroves, how we can apply climate smart thinking to our mangrove work, and then what are the most effective interventions to conserve and restore mangroves under climate change going forward. So let's start by what is climate smart conservation. So we all know climate change is affecting coastal ecosystems globally. I don't think that's really in any doubt. And we're seeing that kind of manifest, and the climate impacts manifest to kind of increased rainfall in some places, decreased rainfall in other places. Here's a mangrove suffering from drought, a lot of increased wind exposure, increased wave exposure. So we're seeing a lot of like physical damage from wind, from waves. You can see some of these mangroves eroding away. Increased air temperatures, increasing sea levels, and not always are these climate impacts directly, they often drive the damage to mangroves, but often can have knock-on effects and feedbacks to communities. So this is a lot of mangrove wood that was harvested following a cyclone hitting Mozambique, and so the mangroves themselves weren't destroyed by the cyclone, but the situation on the ground led to people harvesting mangroves following that cyclone, which led to a lot of mangrove clearance. So there's a lot of different issues kind of wrapped up in how climate change affects mangroves and coastal ecosystems and the people who depend on them. And so one of the clear lessons that we've kind of had over the last decade or so is protection is not enough. And so in the past, kind of the classic conservation approach is you protect an area, and then as long as you're doing management of that protected area and you're adaptively managing the protected area, you think that the biodiversity or the ecosystems there will persist. But we know that protected areas focused on managing local threats will still be lost. We know that restoration and repair activities will be exposed to more climate-induced threats in the future. And so we really do have to accept and actually manage greater climate threats and manage for change in the future. And this is a big change in how NGOs think about conservation that's really been happening in the last decade in all sorts of our work in many different ecosystems and places. And so WWF defines climate smart conservation as the intentional and deliberate consideration of climate change in natural resource management, realised through adopting forward-looking goals and explicitly linking strategies to key climate impacts and vulnerabilities. So it's really about really intentionally and deliberately considering the impacts we think climate change will have, and setting up our strategies and our management and whatever we're doing to really think about that and be forward-looking around being aware of those climate impacts. And so we have some principles for climate smart conservation that guide our work. And we often use these principles when we're thinking about designing projects to think about how to make the project more climate smart. And so, as I said in the definition, it's about including deliberate actions that manage specific climate change risks, embracing novel forward-looking approaches beyond traditional conservation methods for protection and restoration. And really one of the big changes here is thinking about managing for change, not just the systems. We have to accept that these ecosystems are going to move, there's going to be changes in the future, and we have to manage and accept that as part of our management, not trying to hold some historic baseline as our reference and trying to hold things to that. We of course have to adhere to social and environmental safeguards and consider the needs of people in a changing climate, and our actions must be integrated to the overall conservation strategy, not form a standalone component. So we want this climate smart thinking to be embedded across everything we do, not just do traditional conservation business as usual and then have a little side project on climate change on the side. We need to be flexible and adapt to emerging climate change challenges and take advantage of new information as conditions change. And this does mean not just changing the activities we do on the ground, but really being open to revising our goals and objectives in places. In some places we may start work and then at some point realise actually what we're trying to achieve is no longer possible under climate change. And so we have to be flexible and understanding about what we actually are trying to achieve. Action should connect to policy, both in its formation and implementation. And we also need to think a lot of this work is around climate adaptation. We also need to think about any impact on climate mitigation as well. And so this all feeds into kind of adaptive management, and I'm sure many of you are familiar with the idea of adaptive management. And so this is a really nice climate smart conservation cycle from the National Wildlife Federation that kind of takes a traditional adaptive management cycle that conservationists and managers often use and thinks a little bit about the climate smarting and thinking about climate change in this context. So that's kind of a little bit of background on how WWF's thinking about climate smart in our work. So a few years ago, we started to think about, okay, so we know climate change is going to affect mangroves, but how big a threat is it to mangroves? We know a lot of the mangrove loss historically has been driven by conversion. A lot of mangroves have been lost to things like aquaculture ponds. So we want to understand how big a threat climate change actually is to the mangroves, especially considering that mangrove loss rates have been declining in the past 20 years. So this is a really interesting paper by Lisa Goldberg, and she looked at all the mangrove loss from 2000 to 2016 globally, and looked at the drivers of loss and categorised them into climate related events, extreme weather events, and large enhanced coastal erosion, and then more direct human driven losses. And each of these little boxes you can see here represents 1% of the loss of mangroves that happened in the region between 2000 and 2016. And we can see that for many parts of the world now, actually the climate-related drivers of loss are actually the biggest driver now of mangrove loss. We see that in North America, in South America, we see it in Australia and Oceania. It's only really Asia and certain parts of Africa that still have lots of loss being driven by direct local human drivers. And so this is really changing how we think about our mangrove work. Like if we know that a lot of the loss now in the last couple of decades has been driven by extreme weather and erosion, we need to think about that and how we do our management of mangroves. But this was kind of very much looking backwards. This was saying what happened between 2000 and 2016. So we really wanted to understand what were the risks going forward. And so to do that, we started to think about like how could we do this? How could we understand what was going to happen? And one of the challenges with mangroves is they're really dynamic ecosystems. So mangroves don't just respond to climate change. If it's like, for example, sea level rise. When sea levels rise, mangroves don't just respond by dying. They can actually respond to that in other ways. They can migrate inland. They can accrete sediment and rise higher to cope with that. So there's a lot of complex dynamics going on that affect how mangroves respond to climate change. And so we worked with Christina Miller, who's at Griffith University, to think about what are the future climate change impacts going to be on mangroves. And so she pulled together a group with WWF and some other partners and built a qualitative network model for over 4,000 mangrove patches globally. So she divided the world's mangroves into these 4,000 unique patches and then built this qualitative network model where you can look at the landward edge of the mangroves and the seaward edge of the mangroves. And we realised quite early on that we needed to separate those out because the dynamics were very different between the seaward and landward edges. And we can start to think about sediment supply as well in here and think about some of these complex interactions that happen through the system. And then from that model, we can start to predict and project forward what's going to happen to mangroves globally. And so she built these models looking at probability of loss. So the reds is pretty high probability of loss. The blues are places that we think there's going to be stability in mangroves or potentially even some gains in mangroves. And we went through several iterations of this model looking at all mangroves globally. And so some of the key things we really understood was obviously the seaward and landward are very different, but also sediment supply is super key here. And so places with high sediment supply have very different dynamics to places with low sediment supply, and also the tidal range those mangroves are exposed to is also important. So microtidal, so places with small tidal ranges are much more vulnerable to climate change than places with macro tidal ranges, places used to huge, big water movements in the tidal range. And so I'll start with the bad news here. The bad news is that the seaward edge of mangroves globally is going to suffer pretty badly under climate change, to be honest. We consistently find that most of these drivers of loss are driving negative outcomes. The one kind of bright spot is some of the places that have high tidal exchange and high sediment supply. We see less impacts of climate change. Those mangroves potentially can cope with some of these drivers. But in places that have small tidal variation or places that have low sediment supply, it's pretty likely that the seaward edge of these mangroves is going to retreat and not going to be able to cope with climate change. When we think about the landward edge of the mangroves, though, it's a very different story. A lot of the landward side of these mangrove forests are actually going to do pretty well under climate change. The biggest threat we see here is actually the coastal development. And so if we're managing for coastal development to ensure that there's not this kind of high coastal squeeze where mangroves are trying to move a little bit inland and they're trapped up against seawalls or infrastructure, as long as we're managing for that, actually the landward fringe of these mangroves is probably going to do pretty well, and many places will expand. So this is a very kind of mixed story for mangroves, depending on the conditions that they exist under. And Christine's mapped this all out for us, looking at kind of globally where these places are, and this works in review at the moment. So I won't go too much through it, but she's done some pretty detailed mapping, and it's really helping us think about the risks for mangroves in different parts of the world where WWF works. And so really our main conclusion is that there is a lot of risk to mangroves, and we really need to actively consider climate change in our mangrove work going forward. So then we came to this question, okay, we know there's this problem with climate change and mangroves. How do we apply this climate smart thinking that we already have at WWF to mangrove ecosystems and our mangrove conservation work globally? And so to do this, we started to think about the scales we can work at. We can work at the individual site level, we can work in some of our spatial planning work we do, we can work in kind of national level as well. And so we wanted to address all three different levels in our work, but we decided we're going to start at the site level. We wanted to really think about it. An individual site, if you as a WWF field conservation officer are doing some mangrove restoration, or you're working with a protected area manager to help provide, say, a management plan for a protected area, what do you actually do to think about climate change in your protected area or your restoration site to address climate change in your mangrove work? So we came to UQ and we teamed up with Kath Lovelock and Gemma Hill to help us think through this. And so we spent a couple of years really thinking about, like, step by step, what do protected area managers, what do restoration practitioners on the ground really need to do to think about climate change and adapt what they're doing to manage for climate change. And we came up with this climate smart mangrove tool. And so this is really a decision support tool for practitioners on the ground to think about mangrove conservation, restoration and management to bring climate change into their thinking. And so it doesn't replace existing best practice guidance around how you should do restoration or how you should do management. It's meant to supplement that, really thinking about the climate change piece and how you should think about climate. And so it's a 6-step process, starting with step 1, where you think about the site characteristics. Then you think about step 2, the climate threats that site's exposed to. You combine your climate threats and site characteristics to do a vulnerability assessment. Many of you who've done climate vulnerability assessments will see this as a kind of very familiar process. Then we think about adaptive capacity, so we identify and assess adaptive capacity at the site and with the communities that live there. Then we identify some of the potential possible climate smart management actions we could take. And then the final step is a prioritisation, thinking about amongst that suite of options that could be taken, what are the ones that we think we should be taking based on a set of criteria we have there. So just to run through this and what this looks like in practice. So step one, we think about site characteristics. Step two, we identify the climate threats, and then we look at the climate vulnerability. So here's a site in Fiji. This is a mangrove fringe. We know from looking at some of the modelling work that Christina's done, and some of the other global models, that this area has rising sea levels, increasing intense storm exposure on this mangrove fringe. We also know the site, so that's our climate threats. We also know that the site is directly facing the ocean and experiencing high coastal erosion. That's our site characteristics. So of course we consider this a highly climate vulnerable site. So that's kind of our first step in this process. Then we think about the social adaptive capacity, and we have some guidance and tools there to think about resources, community willingness, institutional organisation capacity, flexibility and governance at the site, to think about what the options are about how we actually respond to this climate problem at the site. And then we start to think about what the actual management actions are that we could take at a site. And so we have a giant Excel, and so this tool is supported, this process is supported by an Excel-based tool that practitioners can go step by step through to help think about the decisions. So we have a lot of potential climate smart actions that could be taken under different conditions. So anything from like adding sediment to increase the elevation of the mangroves, to address sea level rise, connecting to fresh water sources if salinity is an issue there, thinking about what species to use in restoration. So there's a whole suite of things, and there's a giant Excel. And if you're interested in this is all public online on the WWF website, so you can go and dig into that and put out those if you want. And we have examples and references of why we think it's a climate smart action to consider. And then we do some prioritisation as well. And I'm not going to talk through all this, but this is fairly standard kind of criteria to think about in prioritisation. And so we've been starting to use this tool now to support our work on the ground. Teams in Colombia, Belize, Fiji, Madagascar, Mexico are all using this in their mangrove conservation programs. And we're starting to advocate to use this tool more widely within the Global Mangrove Alliance, which is a network of a lot of NGOs working to support mangrove conservation. We're doing a lot of outreach around this. And so the tool is public. If you just Google Climate Smart Mangrove Support Tool and look on the WWF website, you can download the PDF guide and the actual Excel tool. Please do have a play with this if you're interested in this. So that was kind of our site-by-site approach to this, thinking about practitioners on the ground. But then we wanted to start to think a little bit about spatial planning and how we can start to think about climate smart thinking in our broader planning work around mangroves. And so we worked with Hannah Villarreal-Rosas, who's a Griffith, to think about this. And so she's been working with WWF teams in both Mexico and Madagascar, who are doing spatial planning exercises around mangrove restoration. And I'm not going to talk too much about this. She's published some of this already. There's some more papers coming out. So you'll feel free to dig into those papers if you want all the details. But in Mexico, we're looking at Marismas Nacionales, which is a national park, some of the largest mangrove areas in Mexico, but a lot of degradations happened to some of those mangroves. This is on the Pacific coast of Mexico. And so she was looking at kind of ecological and socioeconomic criteria and wrapping in some of this climate smart criteria into this to look at like where you actually do restoration and combining ecological and social as well to select sites. And so this was kind of taking a more classic prioritisation approach, but actually building the climate smart criteria into that prioritisation. So we're considering those alongside all the other criteria you normally consider. And so this work is now the Mexico WWF team is actually working with partners actually doing this restoration following this plan now in this park. And the same in Madagascar, she did a prioritisation there, exactly the same with WWF Madagascar. And there's now several community groups actually restoring following these plans. So this was a really interesting example of how you can actually build the climate smart criteria into spatial planning. And then we wanted to go to the national scale. So Hannah started working with the governments of Belize and Madagascar to think about climate smart criteria to the national scale. And so that NDCs are nationally determined contributions under the Paris Climate Agreement are actually generating really significant pathways for mangrove restoration. A lot of countries are committing to mangrove restoration, both for climate adaptation and climate mitigation in their NDCs. And so this is kind of creating a race as countries set more and more ambitious restoration targets, and then they're struggling of how do they actually deliver them, where do they actually restore. And so Ham has been working with both the governments of Madagascar and Belize to support this. So Belize has set this target, 4,000 hectares of mangrove restoration by 2030 in its NDC. And so she's been applying some of these spatial models, thinking about climate smart actions at the national scale for Belize. And Belize, you can see some of the climate projections here for the coastline. There's some pretty severe climate impacts projected for the future. And so as part of this assessment, she worked with Christina Bulow and some of those models Christina has done, which I showed you earlier. And so we were looking at kind of what the business as usual scenario would be, which is on the left panel here, for the landwood and seawood mangroves. And then once Ham had done what she did, a lot of these community consultations, workshops, spent a lot of time in Belize with the WWF team there, thinking about what are the climate smart actions that could be taken and produce this kind of mangrove friendly approach, or like what the actions are and the change that would need to happen are. And what's interesting is because we have Christina's models, we can start to look at how these actions will actually change the future trajectory for mangroves when we start to do this restoration. And you can see here, this is a probability of loss from red to yellow. So red is more likely to be lost. What we can see is that for most of Belize, these are the different parts of Belize. Most of Belize, under business as usual, there's quite a high probability a lot of these mangroves are going to be lost, both on the landward and seaward edge, but the seaward edge is much more severely at risk. Once we start to adapt some of this to think a bit more about climate smart approaches and some of the actions that Ham has mapped out, we can, for the landward edge, we can reduce the probability of loss on average from 65% to 33% of mangroves. So we can have a pretty big impact on the landward edge of the mangroves through to our conservation work. But unfortunately, the seaward edge, even if we do all these climate smart actions, in reality, the models are telling us we can probably only reduce the probability of loss from 94 to 92%. So there's not really much we can actually do under climate change to save that seaward edge of the mangrove forest. But the landward side, we can do a lot and have a lot of impact on mangroves there. And so a lot of this stuff is now being wrapped up into a national restoration plan for Belize that the government is going to implement. So this is very much work in progress that Ham is doing with the government there. So then we come to the final question I want to talk about in this presentation, which is what are the most effective interventions for mangroves under climate change? So often when we're thinking about what we do, we have some places we're working, we have priority places that have WWF teams on the ground. And we're often faced with a challenge of like, what do we do for mangroves there? Do we do more protection? Do we do restoration? And you can make the case of why both of those types of interventions will be impactful. And in most cases, both of those will deliver benefits. But the question we're often asking ourselves is which is the pathway that will give us the most impact? Which is the pathway that will give us the biggest return on investment conservation funding? And so we wanted to start thinking about this in terms of climate change. So we started to have some conversations and look at this. And then we very quickly realized that forget climate change, we don't even really know how effective most conservation interventions are currently for mangroves without even thinking about climate change in the future. So we kind of had to pause some of that thinking and start to do some evaluation and thinking around existing conservation interventions, how effective have they been in the past for mangroves? I'm just going to give you a few really quick snapshots here. I don't have time to talk through everything that we've been doing, but we've worked with a few people like Nadine Heck at East Carolina University. She's done a lot of work looking at evaluating protected areas and looking at human-driven mangrove loss in protected areas and how different protected areas function. Some really interesting results around governance of protected areas. A lot of the nationally governed protected areas globally have much higher rates of mangrove loss than others. The yellows, sorry, I shouldn't put it here on this. The yellows and the reds are human-driven loss. The greens are the climate-driven, the erosion and the weather. So we're most concerned really about. We're concerned about both, but the yellow stuff is the stuff that actually managers on the ground can really manage day to day for. There's also a lot of variation based on our ECM protected area categories as well. in terms of mangrove loss rates. Encourage you to read her paper if you're interested more in that. We also don't just think about protection in terms of protected areas. So many of you who work on like fisheries and issues like that are probably used to thinking about MPAs and the role of MPAs in protection. But mangroves, we also do a lot of national policy work as well. So for example, in Fiji, we've spent the last 4 years trying to get a national protection law reinstated for mangroves that prohibits cutting and clearing mangroves. So we also do a lot of policy work, and there's a lot of policy mechanisms we can initiate and use and levers to use for mangrove protection. But there's very little evaluation of actually whether any of these policy interventions work. So we worked with Lydia Sigodian from Georgetown University Law Centre. We pulled together a team with her to look at national protection laws for mangroves globally. So we looked at like 116 countries, something like that, which represents about 99.5% of all mangroves globally. And we came to the conclusion that 60% of the world's mangroves are actually covered by national laws that explicitly restrict cutting, clearing, and conversion. And about 14% of these are really high protection laws that prevent all cutting or clearing. 28% are under medium protection laws that allow some uses but have some restrictions around use. And then 18% are under quite low levels of protection, which means there is a legal protection, but it's probably not having that much impact. We also looked at a ton of other stuff around coordination mechanisms and national policies. I'm not going to mention that now. But we realised that this was really interesting to see, because we've been supporting these national protection laws. We look at a lot of the protection literature around mangroves, and everything's focused on protected areas. There's been no previous evaluation of the policy side of things. So this was really interesting to actually realise that 60% of the world's mangroves are protected under some form of national law, and we're writing this up at the moment, so look out for that, and a lot more of a deep dive on some of the other policy work for mangroves. But the key thing from this is great to know that these policies are in place, but what we really want to do is ask the question, are they working? And so we teamed up with Chris Brown at University of Tasmania, and he's been doing a global impact evaluation on these protected area, also on these national protection laws, to look at the impact they're having on mangrove rates of loss. And so he's done an impact evaluation using matching to basically do a comparison to control for all the kind of confounding variables that you can, to really try and understand what the impact has been. And so this is very preliminary work. We're still kind of iterating on this at the moment. So don't quote these results, please. They might change in the future. But what we're looking at here is the risk of loss. And so we're looking at human-driven mangrove loss in 5E blocks across the bottom here. And so basically, the lower the point is, the more that the policies are reducing loss rates for mangroves, basically. So we want these points to be lower. The lower they are, the more those national policies are working. And what we can see is when we look at all cutting restrictions, generally there is an impact of them. It's a little bit variable between different periods of time. This is just looking at human-driven mangrove loss. And then when we look at the more strict ones, we also see evidence that the strict protection laws that are in place do have a slightly more positive outcome. They are slightly better at protecting mangroves, but it's not a huge difference, to be honest, there. So we're still kind of exploring these policies in an impact evaluation framework that Chris is leading. Okay, that was a huge tangent because we wanted to understand what interventions we should be doing under climate change. And now we have a bit of evidence around like how they're working currently. We can start to think about how they might work in the future. So we went back to Christina and said to her, we want to know what interventions we should do where. And so she has built a dynamic coastal ecosystem model, and it's very similar to the model she previously did, and has just published on some previous models like this, where we accept that like the best intervention will vary depending on which location we're in. We're thinking about different interventions we can use. We could be doing mangrove restoration, we could be doing mangrove afforestation, so planting mangroves in places that didn't previously have them. We could be investing in protected areas. We could be investing in national policies for protecting mangroves. So these are kind of like our restoration interventions, these are kind of protection interventions. We also know there's all these different drivers of loss. There's a climate drive, there's storm, sea level rise, some erosion, but there's also coastal development, which is a big problem here. And so she's built this dynamic coastal ecosystem model that basically allows us to track what happens to mangroves that are unprotected kind of through the system or protected, considering space for land migration and movement of mangroves, considering the roles protected areas might have, considering the roles that national legislation might have. It's quite a complex model, and I'm not going to like try and explain everything in it, but we're writing this up at the moment for publication, so hopefully there'll be something I can share soon. But if you want more, I can connect you with Christina. So she built this model, and she's run this model for over 4,000 mangrove patches globally, looking at what actions would generate the greatest mangrove extent to 2050 under climate change. So we're thinking about, from this suite of actions we can take, what should we be doing in each place to maximise mangrove outcomes. And she's done a lot of interactive mapping and tools for us so that we can explore these places globally, and we can zoom in at different places to look at them to help inform what we're going to do in those places. And the conclusion from this is really that we need, in most places, we need a combination of protection and restoration to maximise outcomes. Mangroves, and so you can see here this histogram is the distribution of each of the over 4,000 patches of mangroves, and you can see that it's a pretty even distribution. So like these are all different combinations of interventions we can do. And so this is really useful because it means there is no one thing we need to go after. We need to be very place specific and think about what combination of conservation interventions we need in each place to address mangrove protection restoration under climate change. So what next? So this is very much a project that's still very underway. A lot of the spatial planning work has been completed, but the restoration is now actually happening on the ground. The national restoration plans are still under development. We're still trying to get those integrated in fastest policies in Madagascar and in Belize. Belize is now working on its third NDC revision, and a lot of this restoration planning is feeding into that. They want to up ambition on restoration targets for mangroves, and so we're using a lot of this data to help frame that conversation about where is actually suitable to do restoration as they think about that. And so we're really actively integrating many of these findings into our mangrove conservation and restoration strategies. And we're also very interested in applying these approaches to some other coastal ecosystems we also work on. So we've learned a lot about climate smart mangrove conservation and restoration approaches, but there's really a lot more still to learn. There's a lot of places that Christina's models showed there's a lot of uncertainty. We need to go and actually look on the ground there to try and resolve some of that uncertainty. And this has been a really powerful partnership between WWF staff globally and many academics, especially Griffith University, who been kind of our main research partners to a lot of this work and anchors a lot of that work. So I just want to say thanks to all the WWF staff and partners in the universities and in the field who've partnered with us to do this. And thank you for listening, and feel free to reach out if you have any questions. My email's there. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That was absolutely amazing. Does anyone have any questions for Dom? I might start with one. So I noticed, obviously, it didn't look very good for the seaward mangroves, unfortunately. And I think it went from 94% to 92%, even with climate smart solutions. So I'm guessing that there's not really anything that can be done for those. As a reef ecologist, is that just accepting that potentially the way that we view these ecosystems is going to change? Obviously on reefs at the moment, we can never get back to that baseline that you mentioned, that historic baseline. It's reframing that reefs are going to be different in the future. Do you think that's kind of where mangroves are heading in that sense? I think so, and I think the interesting thing is, like, because we're talking about a forest that has the landward fringe and the seaward fringe, it's also migration, right? It's accepting that there will be loss on that seaward fringe, that we can't protect it. There's no, and it's very, like, the investment required to protect it is not really a good investment. But really thinking about how we can make space for those mangroves to migrate in that. They will still have a seaward fringe, but that fringe will be further back in 90 years. And so if we can make space and make sure the space for the landward fringe to be further inland, then you can still have mangroves with a similar sort of area potentially in some of these places, but it's just allowing that migration space.
So I think it's a little more optimistic than reefs because those mangroves could still function pretty much the same way mangroves historically have functioned. It's just accepting that in a slightly different location. Whereas reefs, I think it's a lot harder to see reefs functioning quite in the same way in the future.
Maybe I need to move into mangrove. Does anyone else have any other questions?
So this is really awesome. I have a couple of questions, especially about the model.
Yeah.
Christina was developing. How are you incorporating uncertainties in these different things? Because there's a lot of uncertainties in like sea level rise, for example.
Yeah. So the model, the incorporation of uncertainty is a key part of that model, and Christina's done a lot of work on that. So we tried to do initially, we started brainstorming how we'd do this all as a quantitative model initially. And we realised that actually with so much uncertainty, it's very hard to do that. And so what the results it presented is a qualitative model. So it's actually each individual patch is much more of a qualitative approach, and then the results are the numerical results are from kind of going across all those individual patches. So it's a qualitative model. That's how we've addressed it. And what we've identified from that is the places where we're pretty certain of what the outcome will be. That's why we have this probability of loss. And then also the places that we don't know what's going to happen. So that's why if the probability of loss goes from like high probability of loss right the way through to like high chance of like stability or potential expansion, and then we have the stone in the middle between them, we don't know. So the model actually identifies really nicely places we're pretty confident of what the outcome will be, and places where we're pretty uncertain, like 50-50 whether the mangrove is going to be there or not in the future. And so they're the places we know that we need to actually go and do some really good ground truth work, because we probably can figure out what's likely to happen, but we just can't do it using data sets like this. We need the field surveys to inform what we think is going to happen.
Yeah, sort of relates to that. Yeah, I think in the beliefs work you had probability of loss. So is that probability of total loss, or did you look at expected area of loss as well, or does the message change if you look at those two things?
So it's not area of loss. So it's probability of the patch of mangroves will experience loss or not. So we're not
any extent.
Over any extent. So we're not actually measuring. It's not a measurement of how much loss will happen. It's the probability that the patch will have loss. And so we're not saying when we say 100% probability of loss from those areas, we're not saying the whole patch is going to disappear. We're just going to say that some of the patch will experience loss. So it's a slightly different. It's a different approach. We originally set out wanting to like be able to do area, and we realised that it's too complicated. There isn't enough data to really like make those conclusions, and so that's why we ended up with this modelling framework. I'm happy to connect you with Christina, because Christina spent like many months thinking about how we do this, and then this is how we came to this conclusion. Like this is the best way to do it, to be like both give useful information, but also not make claims that we can't stand by projecting more certainty than we actually have in what's going to happen. You both went at the same time.
Thanks so much for that. It was so interesting. I was just wondering, with the example in Belize, so do WWF staff work directly with like government departments in trying to work out those NDCs and helping work in that space? Is that how WWF engages with that side of policy sort of thing?
Yeah, so it's so the NDC is a little bit different, but like generally for mangrove policy and some of the coastal management policy, the WWF Belize office works very closely with the government departments that are responsible for that, and also some of the communities in those areas that work's going to happen. So we have a lot of input into helping shape some of that work. We're very heavily like involved in like making suggestions to those government departments, and then obviously the government departments make the final calls on what they're going to do. But we have a very close relationship to help provide advice and support to them. The NDC is a little bit different because the NDC is a much larger process which covers a much wider scope. So within that NDC there is a pillar of work around coastal ecosystems and coastal management. And so we're very involved in some of the consultations that the Belize government's having around that and helping shape that around conversations around what restoration targets should be, what protection targets should be, and some of the fisheries issues as well that are in there. We're very involved in that consultation process, having kind of meetings with all the different parts of government, kind of providing advice and support to them around what we recommend should be there. But again, it's all for the government to make the final decision on, but we work very closely with the partner. Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know too much about mangroves, but I assume there's some species that prefer the seaward side and some species that prefer the land side. Do you expect both, like if there's two species, for example, do you expect both of them to shift, or the one that's like more on the land side to take over? And then to follow that up, do you consider species diversity or more just area size of mangrove success?
Yeah, really good questions. So I think we're thinking that like the landward species, there is definitely this gradient of species. We'd expect the landward species to move more landward and the seaward species to move a little bit more downward as well, but still be on the seaward exposed edge. So as that seaward edge protrudes back, there would still be the seaward species there, but they'd just be a little bit closer to land. So that's how we're thinking about it. Whether there's enough time for mangroves to really respond in that way is still to be seen. But I think we would expect in most places to see that. And then in terms of diversity and what we're actually measuring, so when we're thinking kind of large scale, we're often thinking about extent because there's not really a good way to think about mangrove forest diversity from these global layers and kind of national layers. When we're thinking at the individual site level with that climate smart tool, biodiversity and the diversity of trees in the forest is definitely something at a site by site level, but we haven't really found a good way to think about that in the larger scale planning yet. So if you have suggestions, I know it's not a problem that's unique to mangroves. A lot of ecosystem planning struggles with capturing species richness of the ecosystem in those planning decisions. So open to suggestions there. There's things we can be doing there.
There's no questions online with this conference. Caramel's online. So great.
Great, thank you. Thanks, Hannah. Yeah.
I was thinking maybe there are organizations or landowners below the state level that could benefit from the existing information you assembled. How could they get access to it? Would it maybe need to get translated, or is there some way to get this into a non-academic audience?
Yeah, so a lot of, I focus more on like the science papers here because I'm of the audience you are here. But a lot of this stuff isn't actually communicated in science papers. A lot of this stuff is being written up for government, and a lot of it's being communicated in presentations as well. There's been a lot of presentations of this work, depending on which country we're talking about, to partners. So Halma, who's online, has done a lot of meetings all across Belize. She was in Belize a few weeks ago, meeting with different community groups, talking to the results of this. Because she was there a couple of years ago doing some initial consultations together. So a lot of it is shared back in that way. And we're also interested in, Belize is an interesting example, because a lot of the mangroves are on private land. So in the next phase of work, we're also thinking about where are the biggest opportunities for conservation and restoration on private lands, and really thinking about how do we communicate some of this to those private landowners and think about what the incentives could be for private landowners to protect their mangroves. So it's very much a work in progress, but I totally take the point. This is not how we communicate it to people in most places. This is really an academic presentation, but yeah, a lot of it is presentations and also web apps as well. We have a lot of interactive web apps that Christina's built for us and Chris Brown built for us to like use some of this data and play with this to let people interact with it. And for WWF, that's super useful because for us and our staff to be able to play with it in an interactive map where they can turn layers on and off, they can zoom in, they can see different things. That's really helpful in getting an understanding of what the results are actually showing.
Please join me in thanking Dom again for a wonderful setup.